When did your parents go too far? I walked into my local branch on Tuesday just to deposit a birthday check from my grandmother. The teller took my ID, typed for a second, and then her entire face went gray. She didn't look back up at me. She just stood up and walked into the back office without saying a word. I figured there was some weird glitch with my account, maybe a flag for fraud. 5 minutes later, a guy in a suit named Mr. Henderson invited me into his office. He didn't shake my hand. He sat behind his desk and stared at me like I was a ghost. He asked me for a second form of ID. I gave him my passport. He scanned it, looked at his screen, and then looked at me. He told me that according to their system, this account had been closed and the balance liquidated 3 days ago because the primary account holder was deceased. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. I told him I was clearly standing right there. I told him it must be a clerical error. He didn't laugh back. He turned his monitor around and showed me a digital copy of a death certificate. It had my name, my social security number, my birth date. It said I had died in a multi-car pileup 2 states away last Friday. It was signed by a coroner and everything. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. I pulled out my phone to call my parents. I wanted to tell them about this insane mistake, but when I tried to make the call, my service was cut off. SOS only. I tried to log into my email. Account disabled. It was like I was being erased in real time. Mr. Henderson called the police. Not to arrest me, but because he was genuinely confused and a little spooked. A patrol officer arrived and ran my prints on a mobile scanner. He looked at the results and then looked at the death certificate. He told me the prints of the person in the morgue matched the prints they had on file for me from a background check I did for work years ago. That was when the terror really set in. If I was here, who was in that morgue? And how did they have my fingerprints? I spent 6 hours at the police station. They finally tracked down the source of the life insurance claim. A $2 million policy had been cashed out on Monday. The beneficiary wasn't my parents. It was a holding company based in the Caymans. The detective, a woman named Miller, started digging into my childhood records. She asked me if I remembered anything weird from when I was a kid. I told her no. I had a normal life. I was an only child. My parents were quiet, successful people who traveled a lot for their medical consulting business. Miller came back into the room around midnight. She looked sick. She told me they had just raided my parents' house. My parents weren't there. They had cleared out the safe and left the country on a private flight Saturday morning. But the police found something in the crawl space behind the water heater. It was a small hidden room. It had a cot, a bucket, and thousands of pages of handwriting on the walls. It turns out I wasn't an only child. I had a twin sister named Elena. My parents never registered her birth. They never gave her a social. They kept her in that crawl space for 24 years. They raised me as the public face of the family. They gave me the education, the clothes, and the life. They raised her as a backup, a literal insurance policy. They spent 2 decades teaching her how to mimic my handwriting and my voice. They even performed amateur surgeries on her to match my scars and moles. Last Friday, they decided it was time to collect. They took Elena out of the house, staged a horrific accident that would make the body hard to identify, and used my identity to claim the money. They left me behind because killing me would have been too messy. They figured by the time I realized I was legally dead, they would be long gone with the cash. The fluorescent lights in the precinct interrogation room were buzzing. It was a low, irritating hum that felt like it was drilling into my skull. Detective Miller sat across from me, her coffee gone cold, staring at a manila folder like it contained a bomb. I just sat there, looking at my hands. My hands, which according to the state of Ohio, were currently cold and gray in a refrigerated drawer 300 miles away. You really didn't know? Miller asked. Her voice was softer now. She wasn't treating me like a suspect anymore. She was treating me like a victim of a plane crash. Know what? I asked. My voice sounded thin, like it was coming from someone else. That I had a sister? No, my mother had a difficult birth, or so she told me. She said she couldn't have any more kids after me. She used to tell me I was her miracle child. Every birthday, every Christmas, it was always about how special I was because I was the only one. I thought about the house. We lived in a beautiful colonial in a quiet suburb of Indianapolis. It always smelled like lemon wax and expensive cooking. My father was a medical consultant, and my mother handled his logistics. They were always busy, always working from home in the basement or the large addition they'd built when I was 5. I was never allowed in the basement. They told me it was full of sensitive medical equipment and chemicals for Dad's work. They said it wasn't safe for a child. I believed them. Why wouldn't I? We found the journals, Miller said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a picture of the crawl space walls. The handwriting was cramped, tiny, and identical to mine. She wasn't just living there. She was studying you. She had a schedule. 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Listen to recordings of Sister's voice. 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Mimic Sister's penmanship. There were hundreds of hours of recordings of you, Chloe. Your dinner conversations, your phone calls with friends, you singing in the shower. They had microphones hidden all over the house. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I leaned over and vomited into the trash can next to the desk. Miller didn't flinch. She just handed me a paper towel. The realization was a slow poison. Every time I had laughed in my bedroom, every time I had cried over a breakup, every time I had argued with my parents about my curfew, she was listening. Elena was downstairs, in the dark, learning how to be me so that one day she could die for me. The police took me back to the house the next morning. It was a crime scene now, draped in yellow tape. The neighbors were standing on their lawns, whispering and pointing. I walked through the front door, and for the first time, the house felt like a hollow shell. It wasn't a home, it was a laboratory. Miller led me to the basement. The sensitive medical equipment was just a bunch of empty crates and a heavy-duty shredder. Behind the water heater, there was a panel that looked like part of the wall. It opened with a hidden latch. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of death, not yet. It was the smell of stagnation, old sweat, bleach, and something metallic. The room was no bigger than a walk-in closet. There was a thin cot with a gray blanket, a stack of my old school textbooks from a decade ago, and the walls, God, the walls. Every square inch was covered in writing. It wasn't just my name or my signature. It was lists of my likes and dislikes. Chloe likes green apples, not red. Chloe bites her lip when she's nervous. Chloe's favorite song is Landslide. There was a mirror in the corner. Next to it was a kit. Scalpels, sutures, and medical-grade skin glue. My heart hammered against my ribs. I have a small heart-shaped mole on my left shoulder. I checked the mirror. I have a jagged scar on my knee from a bike accident when I was 10. They did it while she was awake, Miller whispered, standing in the doorway. We found the local anesthetics. They didn't want to risk a hospital. They carved you into her. I couldn't look anymore. I ran out of the basement, out of the house, and collapsed on the lawn. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I didn't exist. My life was a blueprint for a murder-suicide that had been 24 years in the making. The investigation moved fast, but my parents moved faster. They had been planning this exit strategy for years. The medical consulting business was a front for a sophisticated money laundering scheme, but the insurance fraud was the grand finale. The $2 million was just the tip of the iceberg. They had emptied their offshore accounts, sold off their stocks, and vanished. By Thursday, the news had picked up the story. The ghost sister, they called it. My face was on every screen, but the name underneath was Elena's. The media didn't know which one was which. To the world, I was the one who died in that car, and the girl walking around was a freakish anomaly. I was staying at a safe house provided by the police. I couldn't go back to my apartment. My key didn't work because the locks had been changed by the landlord who thought I was dead. I had no money. My credit cards were canceled. I was a literal non-entity. Miller came by on Friday evening. She looked looked exhausted. We tracked the flight, she said, sitting on the edge of the cheap motel bed. They landed in Street Kits. From there, they took a boat. We lost the trail in the Grenadines. They're gone, Chloe. They have new names, new faces, and your money. It's not my money, I said. It was never my money. It was hers. She paid for it with her life. There's something else, Miller said. She hesitated, then pulled a small, clear plastic bag from her pocket. Inside was a gold locket. The coroner found this in the wreckage. It was tucked inside the girl's, Elena's, throat. She must have swallowed it right before the crash. I took the bag. My fingers trembled. I recognized the locket. It was a cheap thing I'd lost when I was 12. I thought I dropped it at the park. I opened the locket with a fingernail. Inside, there wasn't a picture of me or our parents. There was a tiny piece of paper, folded into a microscopic square. I unfolded it with tweezers Miller lent me. In handwriting that was perfectly hauntingly mine, it said, "Run, Chloe. They're coming back for the rest." The room went cold. I looked at Miller, and I saw the same realization dawn on her. The insurance policy was $2 million, but my father had another policy, a much larger one, a $5 million policy for accidental death and dismemberment. For me, the surviving daughter. They didn't just kill Elena to get the $2 million. They killed her to set the stage. They needed a death to prove the identity. Now, all they needed was a body that actually matched the prints on file, without any amateur surgery inconsistencies. They needed the original. They're not in the Grenadines, I whispered. The flight was a decoy, Miller said, reaching for her radio, but she didn't get to finish the call. The window of the motel room shattered. A flashbang grenade skittered across the carpet. The world turned into white noise and blinding light. I felt hands on me, strong, familiar hands. I smelled my father's cologne, expensive sandalwood, and tobacco. "Don't struggle, miracle child," he whispered into my ear. "We have to finish the paperwork." I was dragged out through the window. I tried to scream, but a cloth soaked in something sweet-smelling was pressed over my mouth. The last thing I saw was Miller slumped against the wall, and the flickering light of the TV showing a photo of me and Elena as babies, two identical faces, one destined for the light, one for the dark. When I woke up, I was in a car, a smooth-riding SUV. My head throbbed, and my wrists were zip-tied behind my back. My mother was sitting in the passenger seat, looking at her reflection in the sun visor mirror and applying lipstick. She looked beautiful. She looked like she was going to brunch. "You're awake," she said, not turning around. "Good. We're almost at the marina." "Why?" I choked out. "You have the money. Just leave me alone." My father was driving. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Chloe, honey, you always were a bit short-sighted. $2 million is a start, but it's not forever money. Not the kind of forever we've planned for. And besides, we can't have you running around telling the police about your sister. It ruins the narrative. You kept her in a hole," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "For 24 years. How could you?" My mother finally turned around. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold, clinical detachment. "We didn't keep her in a hole, Chloe. We kept her in reserve. We gave her a purpose. Without us, she would have been nothing. Just another mouth to feed. This way, she contributed to the family's future. She saved me," I said, thinking of the locket. "She swallowed that note because she knew you were coming for me." My father laughed. "It was a dry, rattling sound. She didn't save you. She was jealous. She wanted to be the only one. If she couldn't have your life, she didn't want you to have it either. But it doesn't matter. The plan is the plan." We pulled into a private marina somewhere on the coast. It was late, maybe 3 a.m. The docks were deserted. A sleek white yacht sat bobbing in the water. They dragged me out of the car. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk. I had to wait. I had to find a moment. As we walked down the dock, my father was busy looking at his watch, and my mother was scanning the perimeter. They were confident. They had spent 24 years being smarter than everyone else. They didn't think I had it in me to be like them, but they forgot one thing. Elena was my twin. We shared the same blood, the same brain, and for 24 years, she had been studying me, but I had been raised by them. I knew how they thought. I knew how they planned. "Wait," I said, stopping near the edge of the pier. "The bag. You left the bag in the car." "What bag?" My mother snapped. "The one with the passports. I saw you put it under the seat." It was a lie. A simple, stupid lie. But in a high-stress situation, even the most meticulous planners can be tripped up by a small detail. My mother looked at my father. He frowned. "I have the passports in my jacket," he said. "No," I insisted, making my voice pitch up in panic. "The Times Other Times ones. The Cayman's ones." I saw the blue folder. My mother hissed in frustration. "I told you to check the car, Richard." She turned back toward the SUV. My father hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip on my arm loosening as he reached for his pocket to prove me wrong. That was the second. I didn't run. I lunged. I slammed my head into my father's nose with everything I had. I heard the crunch of bone. He screamed, clutching his face, and I spun around, using my tied hands as a club to knock him off balance. He tripped over a mooring line and went over the side. The splash was loud in the quiet night. "Richard!" my mother screamed. She pulled a small silver pistol from her purse. I didn't wait. I dived into the water after him. The cold was an electric shock. I struggled to stay afloat with my hands tied, but the salt water gave me just enough buoyancy. I saw my father thrashing nearby. He couldn't swim well. He'd always hated the water. I kicked toward him, not to save him. I grabbed him with my legs, wrapping them around his waist, and used my weight to push him under. He clawed at my legs, his fingernails tearing my skin, but I didn't let go. I held him down, watching the bubbles rise to the surface in the moonlight. I thought about Elena. I thought about the crawl space. I thought about the amateur surgeries. I held him until the bubbles stopped. By the time my mother reached the edge of the dock with the gun, I had ducked under the pier, hiding behind the thick barnacle-encrusted pilings. She was screaming my name, her voice shrill and hideous. "Chloe, you bitch! I'll kill you. I'll erase you for real." She fired a shot into the water, then another, but she couldn't see me in the shadows. I heard sirens in the distance. Miller. She must have regained consciousness and tracked the car's GPS. My mother heard them too. She looked at the yacht, then back at the road. She was a survivor first. She didn't stay for her husband. She didn't stay for me. She ran toward the end of the dock and jumped onto a jet ski tied to a neighboring boat. She sped off into the dark just as the police cruisers roared into the marina. They pulled me out of the water 10 minutes later. I was shivering violently, my skin blue. Miller was there, her head bandaged, her eyes burning. "We got him," she said, looking at my father's body being pulled onto the dock. "But she's gone. She won't get far," I said. My voice was steady now. "How do you know?" I looked at the water. I thought about the journals. Elena hadn't just written about me. She'd written about Times them. She'd spent 24 years listening to their secrets through the floorboards. She knew every contingency, every offshore account, every bolt hole. And in the back of the locket, hidden behind the tiny piece of paper, she'd left a series of numbers, coordinates, account numbers, passwords. Elena hadn't just been a backup. She had been a spy. It took 6 months to rebuild my life, or rather, to build a new one. I'm legally alive again, though the process was a nightmare of paperwork and DNA tests. I sold the house in Indianapolis. I didn't want a dime of the insurance money, so I donated it all to a foundation for missing and exploited children. My mother is still out there somewhere. The FBI is looking for her, but she's a ghost. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I swear I can hear a scratching sound behind the walls. I know it's just the wind or the house settling, but I still check. 14 months. That's how long it took to translate the microscopic string of numbers Elena had hidden in the locket. It wasn't just a list of passwords. It was an entire financial ecosystem. My parents had spent 2 decades building a fortress, but Elena had spent 2 decades mapping the structural weaknesses from beneath the floorboards. She knew about the Malta shell shell companies. She knew about the bearer bonds in Zurich. She knew my mother's maiden name wasn't just a trivia fact, but the decryption key for a dormant account in Panama. I didn't give the numbers to Detective Miller. The FBI is thorough, but they are loud. They leave paper trails. They issue subpoenas. If my mother smelled a federal subpoena, she would vanish again. I needed to be quiet. I hired a forensic accountant in Seattle who asked 0 questions as long as he was paid in cryptocurrency. It took him 3 weeks to trace a recurring monthly withdrawal of $4,000 to a private villa rental in Rotan, Honduras. The renter was a woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor. It was almost funny. She couldn't completely let go of the ego. She named her alias after the daughter she kept in a box. I flew into Juan Manuel Galvez Airport on a Tuesday afternoon. The heat hit me like a wet towel the second I stepped off the plane. I rented a battered Suzuki Jimny and drove out to the western edge of the island, where the roads turned from cracked asphalt to dirt. The villa was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who believed she deserved the world. White stucco, terracotta roof, infinity pool, overlooking the Caribbean. I parked a quarter-mile down the road, tucked the car behind a grove of sea grape trees, and waited. I watched her for 3 days. She looked older. The island sun had baked her skin, bringing out deep lines around her mouth and eyes that Botox used to hide, but her posture was the same, rigid, superior. She still drank her coffee black on the terrace at 7 a.m. She still wiped the rim of her glass before she drank from it. She was living a quiet, luxurious life on the bones of 2 daughters. On Friday morning, I opened my laptop in the passenger seat of the Jimny. I tethered it to a prepaid local phone. I brought up the portal for the Panamanian bank. My mother had $2.4 million sitting in that account. It was her safety net, her retirement fund. I typed in the credentials Elena had provided, a 6-digit alphanumeric code followed by a secondary passphrase, miracle. The screen flashed green. Access granted. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I just felt a cold, heavy certainty. I initiated a wire transfer. I didn't take the money for myself. I sent every single penny to the same children's foundation I had donated the life insurance payout to. It would be tied up in legitimate charity trusts by noon, untouchable. I watched the balance drop from $2,410,500 to $0. Then, I got out of the car and walked up the dirt road to the villa. The gate was unlocked. Arrogance. She didn't think anyone could find her here. I walked around the back, stepping quietly on the terracotta tiles. The sliding glass door leading to the living room was open, letting in the ocean breeze. She was standing in the kitchen, her back to me, slicing a lime on a marble cutting board. "You're out of money," I said. She froze. The knife stopped halfway through the fruit. She didn't drop it. She didn't scream. For a long, agonizing 10 seconds, she just stood there, letting the sound of my voice process in her brain. Then, she slowly turned around. Her face was a mask of pure shock, quickly replaced by something else. Calculation. She was already trying to find the angle. She looked at me, then looked past me, checking if I had brought the police. "Chloe," she said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white around the knife handle. "You found me." "Elena found you," I corrected. "I just followed her map." She set the knife down on the counter. She wiped her hands on a linen towel. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always were clever. But coming here alone? That was stupid, sweetheart. Nobody knows you're here. You're out of your jurisdiction." "I didn't come here to arrest you," I said. "And I didn't come here to kill you. That would be too quick." She let out a short, patronizing laugh. "Then what? You're going to extort me? You want your cut? Fine. I can wire you $500,000 by tomorrow. You can go back to America and pretend none of this happened. Try to log in," I said. Her smile faltered. "What? Check your phone. Check your account in Panama. The one under Vance. Do it." She stared at me for a moment, then snatched her phone off the kitchen island. She tapped the screen frantically. I watched her eyes dart back and forth. I watched the blood drain from her face until she looked as gray as the teller at the bank back in Ohio. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice cracking. "It's gone," I said. "All of it. You have the cash in your wallet and that's it. You can't pay the rent on this villa. You can't bribe the local port authority. You can't buy a ticket out of here." "You little bitch!" she screamed. She lunged for the knife on the counter. I was faster. I had spent the last year taking Krav Maga classes 4 days a week. I didn't learn it for sport. I learned it for this exact moment. I grabbed her wrist, twisted it sharply, and drove my knee into her stomach. She gasped, dropping the knife, and collapsed onto the tile floor. She curled into a ball, coughing and wheezing. I stood over her. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. "You're a ghost now, Mom," I said, looking down at her. "Just like you made me. Just like you made Elena. You have no identity, no money, and nowhere to run." I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Not American sirens. The high-pitched, warbling wail of the Honduran National Police. "I made a call on the way up," I told her, stepping back toward the open glass door. "I told them an undocumented foreigner was trespassing in this villa. They're very strict about that down here, especially when you don't have the cash to pay the fine." She looked up at me, her face contorted in pain and rage. "They'll deport me. The FBI is waiting for me. If you're lucky, they deport you," I said. "If you're not, they put you in a cell in Tegucigalpa while they figure out who you are. And without your money, no one is going to rush the paperwork." The sirens were getting louder. Tires crunched on the gravel outside the front gate. "Chloe, please," she begged. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard my mother bleed. It sounded unnatural, like a machine trying to mimic human emotion. "You're my daughter." "No," I said, stepping out into the sunlight. "I'm your insurance policy, and I just expired." I walked back down to the beach, keeping to the tree line as the police cruisers swarmed the property. I didn't look back. I got into the rented Jimny, turned the key, and drove toward the airport. It rained for 3 straight weeks my first November in Seattle. I had a small apartment above a bakery in Capitol Hill. It always smelled like wet asphalt and yeast. I worked logistics for a mid-level freight company under my real name. I didn't hide. Hiding is what guilty people do. I walked up the stairs on a Tuesday evening, carrying a bag of groceries. I put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. The door was already unlatched. I didn't drop the groceries. I didn't gasp. I reached into my coat pocket, wrapped my fingers around the heavy steel frame of the folding knife I carried everywhere now, and pushed the door open with my shoulder. There was a man sitting in the armchair by the window. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like an adjunct professor. Tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, thinning gray hair, but there was a suppressed pistol resting on the coffee table next to my mail, placed there with the casual precision of someone who used it for a living. "You have excellent taste in coffee," he said. He had a slight accent. "Dutch, maybe, or Belgian. I made a pot. I hope you don't mind." I closed the door behind me. I didn't take my hand out of my pocket. "Who are you?" "My name is Elias," he said. He didn't stand up. "I represent the people your parents used to work for. The medical consulting clients. The money laundering." "My parents are gone," I said. "My father is dead. My mother is in federal custody." "I know," Elias said, taking a sip from one of my mugs. "We know everything about your family's recent restructuring. We also know about the $2.4 million you wired from an account in Panama to a children's charity." My stomach tightened. "It was a very noble gesture, Chloe," Elias continued, his voice perfectly level. "The problem is, that wasn't your mother's money. It was our money. And it was only a fraction of what your parents stole from us before they tried to disappear. They owe us $12 million. "I don't have it," I said. "We are aware," he replied. "Which brings us to the uncomfortable part of this conversation. Your mother has been very talkative in federal lockup. We have people inside, of course. When they asked her where the rest of the money was, she swore she didn't know. She said your father handled the physical assets, but she did give us something else." He reached reached into his jacket. My grip on the knife tightened. He slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto the table next to the gun. She said you kept a copy of the journals, the ones your sister wrote in the crawl space. She said if anyone knew where Richard hid the bearer bonds, it would be the girl who spent 24 years listening to his every word. I stared at the gun. I stared at Elias. My mother had sold me out from a concrete cell just to buy herself a few more weeks of breathing. I have 72 hours, Elias said, finally standing up. My employers are not as patient as I am. Find the bonds, Chloe. Or we will do to you what your parents did to Elena, only we won't bother with the anesthesia. He didn't take the gun. He just walked past me, opening the door and stepping out into the rainy hallway. I stood there in the quiet apartment, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. I didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who still believed the world was fair. I put the groceries down. I walked over to my laptop and booked a red-eye flight to Chicago. FTC SeaTac wouldn't hold a high-profile flight risk like my mother. The feds had moved her to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago. It's a concrete triangle that looks like a dystopian skyscraper, right in the middle of the city. It took me 24 hours and a very expensive lawyer to secure a visitor's pass. We met in a room divided by thick smudged plexiglass. When the guards brought her out, I almost didn't recognize her. The island tan had faded to a sickly prison gray. Her hair was entirely white at the roots. The arrogance wasn't gone, but it was brittle now, hiding behind hollow eyes. She picked up the phone on her side of the glass. I picked up mine. You look terrible, I said. She let out a dry, rattling breath. They're going to kill me in here, Chloe. You know that. The cartel, the syndicate, whatever you want to call them. They have guards on the payroll. They slip glass into my food. They stand outside my cell at night. Good, I said. She flinched. I gave you life twice. You threw me to wolves to save your own neck. Elias paid me a visit. Her eyes darted to the camera in the corner of the room, then back to me. I had to give them something. They were going to slit my throat in the shower. Your father hid the bearer bonds. He never told me where. He said it was our ultimate insurance policy. If we got caught, we could trade the bonds for immunity. Where are they? I don't know, she hissed, pressing her hands against the glass. But you do. Elena knew. She listened to him. She documented everything. It has to be in her notes. The police have the journals. They're locked in an evidence room in Indiana. You read them, she said, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Before you gave them the locket. Before you tracked me down. You know how she thought. Think like her, Chloe. Where would Richard bury 12 million in paper? I looked at the woman who raised me. I tried to find a shred of maternal warmth, a flicker of genuine regret. There was nothing. Just an animal caught in a trap, willing to chew off its own leg or mine to get free. He trusted dirt, I said softly, remembering a fragment of text from the basement wall. Dad doesn't trust banks. He likes things he can touch. He likes things under the earth. My mother nodded frantically. Yes, yes. Where? I hung up the phone. She screamed something from the other side of the glass, banging her fists against the plexiglass as the guard stepped in to drag her away. I didn't look back. I walked out into the freezing Chicago wind. I had 48 hours left. I didn't fly back to Seattle. I rented a car and drove south, down I-65, back toward Indiana. Elena's journals were in police custody, but I didn't need to read them again. I had spent months agonizing over those photos Detective Miller showed me. I had memorized the jagged, cramped handwriting. My father was a creature of habit. He was a narcissist. Narcissists don't hide their treasure where they can't visit it. They want to admire it, but he also couldn't keep it at the house. I drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of Indianapolis. It was dusk when I arrived. The iron gates were open, the groundskeepers shed dark. I drove slowly down the winding paved paths, past the sprawling mausoleums and the neat rows of headstones. I stopped in section 4. When they staged the car crash, they didn't just need a death certificate. They needed a funeral. It was part of the performance. They had a closed casket service for the tragic loss of their only daughter. They paid for a premium plot. I walked through the wet grass, holding a heavy flashlight and a collapsible camping shovel I'd bought at a hardware store on the highway. I found the headstone. Chloe Vance, beloved daughter, taken too soon. I stared at the granite. They had buried an empty box filled with sandbags to match my weight, just in case anyone got suspicious before the cremation they had scheduled for later that week. But the police had interrupted the cremation when they raided the house. The casket was still in the ground. He likes things under the earth. I started digging. It was grueling, blister-inducing work. The ground was cold and packed tight. Hours bled away in the dark. My hands bled, staining the wooden handle of the shovel. Every time a car drove past on the highway miles away, I froze, killing the flashlight. Around 3 a.m., the shovel hit metal. It was a shallow grave. They hadn't wanted to pay the union grave diggers for a full 6 feet, bribing the director to keep it at 3. I cleared the dirt away from the lid of the bronze casket. My breath loomed in the freezing air. I jammed the edge of the shovel under the latch and threw my weight onto the handle. Metal groaned, then snapped. I pushed the lid open. Inside, there were no sandbags. There was a heavy, waterproof Pelican case. I hauled it out of the dirt. It weighed easily 40 pounds. I wiped the mud off the dual combination locks. I didn't need to guess the numbers. I knew my father. I spun the dials, my birthday, and Elena's birthday, the one they never celebrated. The latches clicked open. Inside, stacked in neat, vacuum-sealed plastic bricks, were rows and rows of bearer bonds. Untraceable, liquid assets. $12 million in paper. I stared at the money. It was the price of my sister's life. It was the price of my parents' souls. I closed the case, locked it, and dragged it back to the rental car. I filled the hole back in, smoothing the dirt and replacing the sod as best I could. By the time the sun came up, I was washing the mud off my hands in a gas station bathroom 3 counties over. I had the money. I could call Elias. I could make the trade and buy my life back. But I sat in the driver's seat, looking at the black case in the rearview mirror. If I gave them the money, Elias's employers would know I was resourceful. They would know I could operate under pressure. They wouldn't let me go back to my quiet life in Seattle. People like that don't discard useful assets. They own them. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus, the forensic accountant in Seattle. Wake up, I told him. It was 4 a.m. on the West Coast. Chloe? He sounded groggy. What's wrong? The flash drive I gave you. The one with the decrypted ledger from the Panama account. Did you keep a backup? You told me to burn it. Did you keep a backup, Marcus? Silence on the line, then a sigh. Yes, I have a fail-safe server. I didn't look at it, I swear. I need you to access it right now. Look at the routing numbers. My parents weren't just laundering money. They were keeping records. Blackmail. Account details of every politician, cartel boss, and corporate executive Elias's syndicate works with. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. A minute passed. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. Chloe, this isn't just a ledger. This is the whole architecture. If the feds got this, they could RICO the entire organization. Compile it, I said. Put a dead man switch on it. Tie it to my biometric login. If I don't check in every 24 hours, that file goes to the Washington Post, the FBI, and Interpol. Chloe, what are you doing? I'm balancing the rest of the ledger. I drove to a FedEx print and ship center in a strip mall outside Indianapolis. I bought a heavy-duty cardboard box. I took out 1 brick of the bearer bonds, about $100,000 worth. I put the rest of the Pelican case inside the box, taped it shut, and shipped it via overnight freight to the Children's Foundation I had donated to previously. Anonymous donor. Then I drove back to the airport and waited. Elias called me at exactly the 72-hour mark. I was sitting in a diner near O'Hare. Are we meeting? He asked. The polite veneer was gone. His voice was cold iron. I have something better than your money, Elias, I said, stirring my black coffee. I have your architecture. I explained explained the dead man's switch. I read him 3 account numbers and the name of a federal judge in Miami that his employers had on their payroll. I heard the silence on his end of the line grow heavy. You stole the money, he finally said. I gave it away. All 12 million. It's gone. They will kill you just for the insult, Chloe. They can try, I said. But if I die, if I go missing, if my heart stops for more than a day, your entire empire burns to the ground. Every account frozen. Every boss indicted. You don't get the money back, Elias, but you get to keep your freedom. That's the trade. He breathed out slowly. You are exactly like your parents. No, I said, looking out the diner window at the gray Chicago sky. My parents hid in the dark. I'm operating in the light. I hung up the phone. I took the SIM card out, snapped it in half, and dropped it into my cold coffee. I paid my tab with a $20 bill from the single brick of bonds I'd kept. I walked out to the rental car. The air was freezing, but for the first time in a year, my chest didn't feel tight. The timer dictated my pulse. For 2 years, my life was measured in 24-hour increments. Every morning at exactly 9 a.m., I opened a sterile black laptop connected to a proxy server and pressed my right thumb to a USB biometric scanner. A green light would blink twice. The dead man's switch would reset. I bought myself another day of breathing. I was living in Bisbee, Arizona. It's a town carved into the side of a copper-veined mountain, sitting a few miles north of the Mexican border. It smells like oxidized metal, dry scrub, and old dust. I went by the name Sarah. I worked the way station at a scrap metal yard, trading cash for stripped copper wire and crushed sedans. It was loud, filthy work, and it paid under the table. It was perfect. It was a Tuesday in August. The thermometer inside the corrugated steel way station booth already read 98 degrees. It was 8:42 a.m. I wiped the grease off my hands with a shop rag, pulled the black laptop from my backpack, and booted it up. The fan whirred, struggling against the grit in the air. The login screen appeared. I plugged in the thumb scanner. I heard the crunch of gravel before I saw the car. It wasn't a local truck loaded with scrap. It was a black, late-model Suburban. It rolled to a stop right in front of the weigh scale, blocking the exit. The dust settled around the tires. The driver's side door opened. He didn't wear a tweed jacket this time. He wore a lightweight linen suit, but the wire-rimmed glasses and the thinning gray hair were exactly the same. Elias stepped out into the blinding Arizona sun. He looked around the salvage yard with mild distaste, sidestepping a puddle of transmission fluid. My chest tightened until my ribs ached. I didn't reach for the laptop. I reached under the plywood desk and wrapped my fingers around the handle of a modified flare gun. I kept loaded with a 12-gauge shotgun shell. Elias walked up to the open window of the booth. He didn't draw a weapon. He just rested his hands on the aluminum sill. You're a very difficult woman to find, Chloe, he said. The slight European accent sounded absurd over the hum of the yard's industrial generators. 2 years. You've caused my employers a great deal of anxiety. How did you find me? My voice was flat. I kept my right hand below the desk. You built a brilliant failsafe, Elias said, adjusting his glasses. The encrypted ledger, the biometric lock, the automated release to the press, and the federal government. Very clever. We couldn't break the encryption, but we didn't need to. We just needed to buy the people who managed the physical server farms where your data was routing. It took 24 months to trace the daily ping back to this specific cell tower. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:46 a.m. If you shoot me, the switch triggers, I said. The syndicate burns. We are well aware, Elias said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's why I'm not here to kill you. We found a solution to our stalemate, Chloe. A compromise. A cold sweat broke out across my neck, chilling me despite the suffocating heat of the booth. What compromise? I asked. My employers realized that killing you is suicide, Elias explained, his voice taking on the soothing, instructional tone of a professor. But letting you walk around with a loaded gun pointed at our heads is unacceptable. So, we built a facility. It's just across the border, in Sonora. Very private, very quiet. He leaned in slightly. I could smell his peppermint breath over the scent of hot diesel. It's a comfortable room, he said. It has air conditioning, a bed, books. We will provide you with meals. And every morning, a guard will hand you a laptop. You will press your thumb to the scanner. Then the laptop will be taken away. You will live a long, healthy life, Chloe. But you will never leave that room. The world tilted. The air in the booth suddenly felt so thin I couldn't pull it into my lungs. I saw the crawl space behind the water heater. I smelled the bleach. I saw the thousands of pages of cramped handwriting on the concrete walls. Chloe likes green apples. Chloe bites her lip. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to make me Elena. They wanted to put me in a box and use my heartbeat as an insurance policy for the rest of my natural life. No, I whispered. It's not a negotiation, Elias said gently. 2 more men stepped out of the back of the Suburban. They were built like brick walls, wearing tactical vests over black t-shirts. They fanned out, flanking the booth. You can come quietly, or we can use a sedative. The sedative might make you groggy, but we will make sure you are awake enough to press your thumb to the glass today. After that, you'll have years to sleep. I looked at the clock. 8:49 a.m. 11 minutes until the switch triggered. 11 minutes until the ledger released and destroyed the syndicate. If I triggered it, I was dead. Every hitman on the payroll would be given my picture. I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder until someone finally put a bullet in the back of my head. But if I didn't trigger it, I was going in the box. The scanner is on the desk, I said, my voice shaking just enough to sound thoroughly defeated. Let me log in. Let me reset the timer for today. Then I'll go with you. Elias looked at me. He looked at the black laptop sitting on the desk. The green light on the thumb scanner was unlit, waiting. Very well, Elias said. Log in, slowly. I brought my left hand up and placed it flat on the desk. With my right hand, still hidden under the plywood, I gripped the flare gun. My thumb is sweaty, I said, wiping my left hand on my jeans. It won't read if it's dirty. Hurry up, Chloe. I didn't reach for the scanner. I kicked the heavy steel door of the booth outward with all my strength. It slammed into Elias, catching him in the shoulder and throwing him backward into the dirt. Before the 2 enforcers could draw their weapons, I whipped my right hand up from under the desk and fired the modified flare gun through the open window. The 12-gauge shell didn't hit either of them. It wasn't meant to. It hit the rusted, 50-gallon drum of waste gasoline sitting 10 feet behind the Suburban. The explosion was deafening. A wall of orange flame erupted, instantly engulfing the back half of the SUV. The shockwave shattered the safety glass of the booth, raining sharp little cubes over my head and shoulders. The 2 enforcers threw their arms up, blinded and burning, stumbling away from the blast. Elias was on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder, staring in horror at the inferno. I grabbed the black laptop. I didn't grab the scanner. I bolted out the back door of the booth, sprinting into the maze of crushed cars. Scanner! Elias screamed over the roar of the fire. I ran. My boots slammed against the dirt, dodging jagged pieces of rusted bumpers and shattered windshields. The salvage yard was a 3-acre labyrinth of stacked steel. I knew every blind corner. I knew every dead end. I scrambled up the side of a crushed Ford pickup, cutting my forearm on a piece of jagged trim. I dropped down the other side into a narrow alley between 2 walls of compacted sedans. I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. Heavy, hurried footsteps. They were spreading out. I looked at my watch. 8:54 a.m. 6 minutes. I crouched behind the rusted chassis of an old Buick. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Blood dripped from my forearm, staining the dry dirt. I held the laptop tight against my chest. If I wanted to live, I had to plug the scanner in. I had to press my thumb to the glass. I had to keep the switch from triggering. And then I had to slip out the back fence and disappear again. I had to keep running. But the image of of the Sonora basement flashed in my mind, the cinder block walls, the locked door, the quiet. I thought about my parents. They had built their entire empire on contingencies, on backups, on fear. They had lived their whole lives terrified of the ledger catching up to them. They created a ghost in a crawl space just to keep themselves safe. And for the last 2 years, I had done the exact same thing. The laptop was my crawl space. The timer was my cage. I looked at the black plastic casing of the computer. 8:57 a.m. Footsteps approached the alley. I saw the shadow of one of the enforcers stretching across the dirt, holding a suppressed pistol. He stepped around the corner of the crushed Ford. He saw me crouching there. He raised the gun. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't beg. I stood up, holding the laptop by the edge of the screen. I swung it like an axe, smashing it down onto the sharp, rusted engine block of the Buick. The screen cracked with a loud snap. Plastic shattered. The motherboard bent and sparked, hissing as it died. I brought it down again and again, until it was just a mangled piece of plastic and wire. The enforcer stopped. He stared at the destroyed machine. "What did you do?" He breathed. "I broke the cage," I said. A moment later, Elias rounded the corner, clutching his arm. He saw the shattered laptop on the ground. He looked at his gold wristwatch. 8:59 a.m. He didn't order the man to shoot. He didn't say a word. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a linen suit. The realization hit him with physical force. The server couldn't be pinged. The reset code couldn't be sent. 9 a.m. Somewhere in a secure server farm, a timer hit 0. Terabytes of encrypted data unlocked. Emails began to auto-send to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the FBI Cyber Division, and Interpol. Bank routing numbers, bribed judges, hitman payrolls. The entire architecture of the syndicate laid bare for the world to see. Elias lowered his hand from his bleeding shoulder. He looked at me, not with anger, but with profound, hollow terror. "You killed us all," he whispered. "I know," I said. "Run." He didn't hesitate. Elias turned and sprinted back toward the burning Suburban. The enforcer followed him. They didn't care about me anymore. I was irrelevant. They had hours, maybe minutes, before their bank accounts were frozen and the feds started kicking down doors. Their empire was ash. I stood alone in the alley of crushed cars. The desert wind blew through the salvage yard, carrying the smell of gasoline smoke and hot metal. I walked 3 miles down the shoulder of Highway 80 before a guy in a flatbed Ford pulled over. He was hauling alfalfa. He didn't ask why I was covered in dust and dried blood. He just asked if I minded the radio. I told him no. I got out at a truck stop outside Tucson. I went into the diner, sat in a back booth, and ordered a plate of eggs and a black coffee. I paid with a crumpled 20 from the roll in my pocket. Above the counter, a TV was playing CNN on mute. For the first 40 minutes, it was just morning talk shows and weather. Then, the screen cut to a breaking news banner, red block letters. Even without the volume, I could understand the chaos. The anchor looked frantic. The footage cut to a massive estate in Miami. FBI tactical vans were ramming through a wrought iron gate. The Chiron read, "Massive data leak exposes global crime syndicate." I took a bite of my eggs. They tasted like ash and cheap butter, but I chewed slowly, swallowing every bite. The screen flashed a montage of faces. Politicians, a federal judge, 2 CEOs of major logistics firms. And then, a face I recognized from Elias's files. The man at the top. He was being led out of a high-rise in Manhattan in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face shielded by a briefcase. The architecture was burning. Every single pillar was coming down. The failsafe hadn't just alerted the authorities. It had alerted the cartels, the rivals, the predators who feed on weakness. Elias and his employers weren't going to survive the week, let alone have the resources to hunt down a ghost in the desert. I finished my coffee, left a $5 tip, and walked to a motel down the road. I paid for 3 nights in cash. I went into the room, locked the door, and stood under the shower until the water ran ice cold, watching the Arizona dirt and my own dried blood spiral down the drain. Then I slept. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't wake up in a panic. I slept for 18 hours straight. When I woke up, the world was a different place, and so was I. I spent the next 6 months moving north. I didn't stay in cities. I stuck to the arterial roads, the small towns that smelled like pine needles and wood smoke instead of exhaust. I worked for a roofer in Colorado for a month. I picked apples in Washington state. I paid in cash. I didn't leave a footprint. The paranoia didn't vanish overnight. You don't unlearn 20 years of looking over your shoulder just because the people chasing you are dead or in jail. Sometimes a car would idle too long outside a diner, or a man in a suit would walk into a hardware store, and my hand would drop to my pocket, feeling for the heavy steel of the folding knife. But slowly, the gaps between the panic attacks widened, from days to weeks to months. I ended up in a town called Astoria, right on the edge of the Oregon coast. The ocean there isn't tropical. It's gray, violent, and freezing. The air always tastes like salt and crushed seashells. It was the absolute antithesis of the house in Indianapolis. I rented a small, drafty cabin at the end of a gravel road. I got a job at a boatyard, sanding fiberglass and repainting hulls. It was physical, quiet work. The people there didn't ask about your past. If you showed up on time and didn't complain about the rain, you were accepted. On a Tuesday in November, almost exactly 3 years since the day I walked into that bank to deposit my grandmother's check, I walked into the local library. I sat down at a public computer. The keyboard was sticky. I opened a browser and typed in a search query I hadn't let myself look up in years. Eleanor Vance trial. The search results populated instantly. The trial had been a circus, but a brief one. The syndicate leak had destroyed any leverage she had. Her high-priced lawyers had abandoned her when their retainers bounced. She had been forced to use a public defender. I clicked on an article from the Chicago Tribune dated 6 months ago. Syndicate money launderer Eleanor Vance sentenced to life in Supermax. There was a photo. It was a courtroom sketch, but the artist had captured her perfectly. The rigid posture, the sharp angle of her chin, but the arrogance was hollowed out. She was 72 years old, and she was going to die in a concrete box in Colorado, 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. She had built a crawl space for my sister. The universe had built one for her. I closed the browser. I deleted the search history. I stood up and walked out of the library into the freezing Oregon drizzle. I didn't feel a rush of vindictive joy. I didn't feel anything at all for her. She wasn't my mother. She was just a woman who had stolen 2 lives and lost her own. I walked down to the docks. The fishing boats were coming in, seagulls screaming overhead, the smell of diesel mixing with the freezing rain. I went into the small, brightly lit office of a local attorney I had found in the phone book. His name was Miller, a coincidence that made me smile the first time I saw it. He was a plump, tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie. "Sarah," he said, looking up from a stack of paperwork. "You got the forms filled out?" "I did," I said, handing him a manila envelope. He opened it, adjusting his glasses. He looked over the petition for a legal name change. The paperwork was ironclad. I had spent the last 2 years establishing Sarah as a real, documented person with taxes and a history, just so I could do this one final thing legally. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, looking at the requested name on the second page. "It's a bit of a process, filing it with the state, getting the new social security card issued. You'll have to update your driver's license, your bank accounts." "I don't mind the paperwork," I said. He stamped the bottom of the form. "All right then. The judge reviews these on Thursdays. It's mostly a formality. Congratulations on the new start." I thanked him and walked back out to the docks. I leaned against the wooden railing, looking out at the churning gray water of the Pacific. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. My parents had erased Elena. They had made her a ghost, a mirror, her a spare part. They didn't give her a name, a birth certificate, or a life. They took everything from her so they could keep everything for themselves, but they failed. The paperwork would clear next week. The state of Oregon would print a new ID, a new birth record, a new life. I reached up and touched the jagged scar on my knee through my jeans, the one I got falling off a bike when I was 10, the one my parents carved into my sister's flesh with a scalpel and local anesthetic. We shared the same face. We shared the same blood. We shared the same scars. But starting next Thursday, I wouldn't be Chloe Vance anymore. Chloe Vance died in a car crash in Ohio. Chloe Vance was a miracle child who never really existed. I watched a freighter on the horizon, cutting through the fog, moving steadily toward the open sea. My name is Elena, and I survived.